We are going to be living with wildlife regardless. If we try to fight that relationship, then we're only going to have problems and this war erupts from it. But if we can learn to coexist with wildlife, then we live a harmonious life with them, alongside them. And there's so many different methodologies that we can use to coexist with them in a peaceful way, and that harmony can happen, and it does. There's plenty of experiences where that has been happening.
So boreal caribou used to be more abundant in Canada, and in some provinces they're not doing too bad. But what do you see that's quite interesting about this picture here? This is their distribution of the boreal caribou. Does anything stand out to anyone? BC and Alberta. So we've got this, even though we've lost a lot of their population in the other provinces, because the humans in Canada, we don't like the north as much. We've really populated the southern parts of the provinces. Those populations have moved up. But in Alberta and BC, it's totally fragmented. There's no more connectivity. Connectivity is critical for this species survival. In parts of Quebec, there are studies done that show when there isn't connectivity between different herds of the caribou, their genetic diversity drops by 20%. And that genetic diversity is critical for creating a species that is going to be resilient in things like climate change, and a species that's going to be able to adapt to whatever pressures are put on them. The largest threat to caribou is fragmentation and loss of habitat. And so we can see in Alberta and BC that has become quite evident. Those populations are said to be very unlikely to ever become self-sustaining. And self-sustaining meaning that they will be at a strong enough level where they will be able to persist for a long period of time. And they will only become self-sustaining if they've got the habitat requirements in place to keep that population healthy and strong. Because of those red marks in Alberta and BC, when the recovery strategy, this comes from the caribou recovery strategy, when that was published, and then when the governments went and looked at it, they said, well, we don't really have much use or much hope in protecting or saving those caribou in Alberta and BC anyway, so why even bother? But they thought they should do something at least. And it was really evident in the language when you read the Species at Risk Act's recovery strategy for boreal caribou. Right in that document, the Government of Canada document, a federal document, it states that caribou need that large range of continuous, undisturbed tracts of forest. And not just any forest. They require old growth forest because their main food source is lichen, and lichen grows really, really slow. And so it needs that old growth forest, which also happens to make the softest toilet paper by many people's claims. And so in BC, that's one of the big problems for their habitat. And if they have these large ranges of connected habitat, then there's a decreased risk of predation. And it also in the recovery strategy, it states how habitat conditions have to be met. So did the governments that are making the decision actually read the strategy that was written by their own biologists? I don't know. Because what's actually being done to protect caribou in BC and in Alberta? Only predator control. And so the government hires helicopters to fly around in northern Alberta and shoot packs of wolves from the helicopter. I imagine that is incredibly stressful. And I imagine, too, that they're not always killing with that first shot. Wolves probably run into the forest and die a horrible, long, extended death. The cost of those helicopters is probably immense to our tax-paying dollars. Then there's the bounties that Louise was talking about earlier that have increased in the province. The use, too, there's a lot of trappers in BC right now that are voicing their opposition to the management policies in BC because they've opened up trapping of lactating females in the spring. And they don't think that's ethical, and they don't want to stand behind that. poisoning. There's poison called compound 1080 that's illegal in every other developed country in the world. You can buy it readily here in Canada and poison whatever carcass you want, throw it out for your target species, the wolf. So lots of really negative things that have been happening for a long time here in Alberta and BC, and also going kind of under the radar. I don't think that the public would be totally in support of this. Has habitat protection been discussed? It's not a consideration. It's not, the decisions that are being made are not being made by, with the basis of science behind them. They're being made by the politicians. And so in Alberta, there's talk of protecting 5% of caribou habitat. 95% of caribou habitat will be destroyed for the one thing that makes us the money here in this province. And so when the politicians are looking at the pros and cons of protecting habitat and protecting wildlife, it's just not the value that these species have. They provide us with immense ecological services that are being totally ignored. And because another service here in Alberta provides us with immense financial gain, then that's outweighing the benefit of having these animals on our land.
I would say probably has some of the worst conservation laws in the world. A lot of other countries look at us when they are aware of what we are doing conservation-wise, and we are just evil in what we've been doing. But a lot of people don't know this. Other people look at Canada and say, oh, they've got all this wilderness and landscape, and they must really be protecting their wildlife, and they come flocking here as tourists thinking that we're doing these great things, and then they just are heartbroken to find out that we are not protecting wildlife like we should. We have absolutely hideous laws surrounding conservation of wildlife, and things need to change, policies need to change.